Okay, everyone. Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We may have some more people that pop in, but on behalf of Dietrich, I would like to welcome you. Thank you for joining us for this professional development event. I'd also especially like to thank Vicki Helgeson, who helped us to connect with this particular topic, and fantastic speaker Laurie Weingart, whose whole research area is on conflict resolution and collaboration. So we're super grateful to her for her time. We're also welcoming today some professionals from the Career and Professional Development Center, in part because as soon as we mentioned that we were doing this, other colleges asked how we could do it. And so we're trying to create a system where we have more people who could be sharing this kind of expertise on campus. So I'll turn it over to Laurie to add any more introductory material that she wants and to go ahead and get started.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Sharon and Vicki. I am Laurie Weingart. I'm a faculty member in the Tepper School in the area of organization, behavior, and theory. I've been at Carnegie Mellon my entire career since I finished graduate school, since that's been over 30 years. And I'm going to talk today about a topic that is very tightly tied to my research and my teaching. So I teach primarily in undergrad, in the graduate school and the business school, and then also executive education. I do a lot of workshops on this topic of conflict and collaboration. So I'm actually going to do 2 workshops because they asked me to do one, but I said, but I've got too much to cover. So I'm going to do 2. I'm doing one this week on managing conflict with collaborators. And then next week, I'm going to do a workshop on having difficult conversations. So, so with that, I'm going to share my screen. And I do, if you can, if you're comfortable turning your camera on, that would be great, because I'd love, since we're a small enough group, it's really good for me to see your reactions and what you're thinking. And I can kind of sometimes see it in your faces, believe it or not. Also, can you see my screen now? Oh, there we go. It's just setting up. All right. So I've gotten really used to teaching online as well. So I even know how to set this all up. So let me just open up my screens. All right. Great to see you. So I'm going to talk today about managing conflict with collaborators in particular. And what I've done is really taken the material that I usually use and customized it to thinking about all the difficulties we have with working with any negotiating conflict, working with collaborators across multiple settings. And I want to start with the general idea, that conflict we often think about as a pretty negative thing, right? It's bad, but actually I want you to think about conflict not as a bad word or describing a necessarily negative process, but one that actually is a natural part of collaboration, and one that if we can harness it well, make it work for us, we're going to be much more effective. All right, so I love this quote. Every conflict we face in life is rich with positive and negative potential. It can be a source of inspiration, enlightenment, learning, transformation, and growth, or rage, fear, shame, entrapment, and resistance. The choice is not up to our opponents or our counterparts, but it's up to us and our willingness to face and work through them. So I try to take that approach and when I teach about conflict and as we're talking about it. So I'm going to take an approach that focuses on where conflict comes from and what we can do about it. So the basic definition, right? Conflict arises when 2 people or a group of people have different interests or opposing interests, and they're interdependent. So we're interdependent, we need to get our work done, but we're either working towards different goals, we're doing different actions, or maybe there's just not enough resources to go around. So let's just start with the goals, right? So conflict can occur because we have goals that aren't compatible. So imagine a collaboration where one person wants to get the work done as quickly as possible, while the other is more interested in producing work to submit to a conference. Now, these conflicting goals could result in disagreements regarding, what an ideal approach should be, what you would be focusing on, what the quality of the product should be. Conflict can also occur as a result of our actions. So like when one person's actions interfere with another person's ability to do their work. So a simple example is I might not be available at the times you need me, or I might not be responsive to your email, which holds you up, or I could allocate work to one team member and take it away from someone else. So again, my actions could interfere with your performance or your ability to get your work done. Or we might have conflict over like allocation of scarce resources. When there's not enough to go around, enough money, time, people, and then conflict often ensues about who's going to get access to what. So both in terms of how it should be allocated or even whether current allocations are appropriate. So lots of different reasons we have conflict. What I'm going to do now is have it start thinking about, well, is conflict good or bad? Is it something that we can harness, and why not? Oh, I see I've got this at the bottom of my screen. Let me move this way. Okay, so what I'd love to do is just have you, I want to, since we have full access here, I think, can I do a poll? Maybe not as a co-host.
Okay, let me make you the host and then that can certainly work.
All right, good, because then I can get a little bit of polling going.
Yep. There you go.
Okie dokie. Let's see. Trying to find it. Okay. All right. So what I'd love to see now is for the people who are here, just kind of give me like a green check if you think conflict is generally good in your experience, or the big red X if you think it's been more problematic for you, if it's generally bad. This is a good way for me to take the temperature of the room. I'm not going to call anyone, don't worry about it. Interestingly, like we've got like 12, 13 responses now, and we're almost equally split. Mm-hmm. Right? And that is so common. You can unvote now, but this is really common for our experiences with conflict, right? It has both positive effect and negative effects. And the answer to the question, is conflict good or bad? It's both, and it depends, right? Like most everything, I think any of my psychologists in the room will say, oh, we say that all the time, right? Both, and it depends. Okay. So let's start with the positive effects. What do we know from the research, right? So conflict has been shown to increase creativity, and it helps to avoid like a false consensus where we think we all agree, but really we don't, but people are afraid to speak up, right? So it avoids that problem. And it surfaces our problems, it surfaces our disagreements, and through conflict and disagreement, we tend to have a better and more comprehensive search and deliberation among the group. So those are all the positive effects we know about. But certainly there are negative effects that happen as well, right? It can get in the way from getting our work done. It interferes with our productivity, and it makes us feel really bad often about ourselves and our relationships with others. It can interfere with group satisfaction, and it's generally a stressful state, right? So it's good and it's bad, and it depends again on how you engage it. It depends on a lot. And so what I'm actually going to do today is focus on the it depends. And there's many things we could talk about, but what I'm going to focus on are three. What the conflict is about, how the conflict is managed, and how the conflict is expressed or communicated. And by focusing on all three, we look at a situational factor, as well as the behavioral things that you can actually do, that you have some agency over to manage the situation. Okay. And by the way, if you have questions along the way, just raise your hands. Yeah.
And there is one in the chat that maybe you can just think about as you go along, Laurie, which is basically about how do you take into account the power differences in these different kinds of things, or some kind of group dynamics that might affect the situation. So it sounds like you're going to get to that.
I'm going to get to some of it, but actually the power dynamics is a major topic for next week.
Oh, okay, great.
So I will talk, I can talk about that today and bring those questions up again, especially when we start getting into the conflict management piece and the approach. That's going to come up as well. I'll give some kind of concrete recommendations. I won't just talk theory, I promise. Okay, so let's just talk about, kind of how do we distinguish between different areas of things we might have conflict over. And we typically divide it into two buckets, right? So you can think about the conflict that you have that relates to the work or the task at hand, and then the conflict that you have that's a little bit more interpersonal in nature, right? So in terms of work-related conflicts, we can then divide those into two buckets. And it's important that we do think about them differently because they're different. So one is just conflict or disagreements about the task. Like, what are we going to do? How does it need to be done? What's the right solution? What's the right answer? So that's what we call task conflict. I'm going to show you some examples of it in a second. I want to differentiate that from process conflict. Process conflict are disagreements about how we're going to get the work done. So our logistics, how we're going to distribute the work, who should do what, how we're going to manage deadlines. And one thing, and I'll show you examples of those too, but I want to point out that process conflicts tend to be more personal than task conflicts. Like our egos kind of get wrapped up in process conflicts, because when we have disagreements over the process, it often feels like people are questioning our abilities or our contributions. Okay. The third type of or bucket here of conflict are these very interpersonal relationship conflicts. And these can be incompatibilities, and sometimes they're communicated in terms of personal attacks, but they could be root causes of those could be related to different value systems. It could be different political preferences, social values, religious beliefs, or so on. We could have conflict over our status, right? So this is who's going to have power in the group. Who has the higher standing? What's the pecking order going to be? Who's going to get the respect? And also we see in terms of relationship conflict, personal attacks that can be explicit or even passive aggressive. And then just basic personality clashes where people just don't get along, kind of people rub each other the wrong way. So all this falls in that bucket of more relationship conflict. So to make it a little bit more concrete, this is some examples from a study that a colleague of mine did where she elicited examples of these and did sorting, more of a qualitative study. But the first were these task conflicts. So here's some quotes from the data set. We disagreed on points of view regarding the cases and what decisions should be made. This was actually from a student group. My group debates a lot in morning meetings about the right way to test. That was from an organizational group. Or we challenge each other's opinions about client needs in order to double check ourselves. So those are all examples of task conflicts. Process conflicts are about, say, having different ideas about the timing and amount of work that needs to be done, or disagreements about how we divide up the work, or where we should be allocating resources, right? Time and money in terms of the timing, when we should be putting our effort and where. So those were examples of process conflicts. And then relationship conflicts are these more kind of, when people talk about my team as ego clashes, or there's a huge problem with arrogance, maybe there's no open fighting, but we have bottled up resentments or sarcasm, or someone always has to be right, and it becomes, and it feels very oppressive, right? So those may be signals of relationship conflict. So you can imagine these things are pretty different from each other, and different in terms of their effects on collaboration, right? So you need to be able to think about how much these occur in your work groups and your collaborations and assess them. So we just want to show you some typical items that are used in measures of different types of conflict in teams. But these are, sure, we use them in our research, but you could also use them to assess your teams and your collaboration. So how much conflict about the work that you do is there in your group? How often do people disagree about opinions regarding the work to be done, or conflicts about ideas in your group? So these are typical questions we would ask. And you're kind of getting the global amount here. Or you could ask questions about disagreements about the way you do things in your work, your procedures, who should do what, relationship conflict regarding personality conflicts, tension, or emotional conflict. So you can, this is why I wanted to record this, and we can make this slide deck available to people who participated as well. So don't worry about writing these down right now. You'll have them available to you. Okay, so why do we care about these distinctions? Well, there's a good amount of research, and this should not be surprising to you, but process and relationship conflict tend to be more harmful than task conflict on teams. Okay, so we see that while all types of conflict interfere with trust in the team, like if people don't disagree with you a lot, you tend to trust them less, but especially process and relationship conflict are associated with lower team cohesion, lower satisfaction, lower commitment, and lower performance. And I say associated with one because you can imagine, you know, it's kind of a recursive system, right? The less cohesive, the more conflict you tend to have, and it kind of is self-reinforcing. Okay. Task conflict is different. Task conflict, its effect on group performance really varies widely from positive to negative across a huge number of contexts and studies. And it used to be, we thought task conflict was always good. And that was in the textbooks. If you have an old textbook on team performance and conflict, it will talk about the benefits of conflict and it won't talk about the downside. One of my most highly cited papers put this to bed. We did a meta-analysis and we discovered that actually what we know after multiple meta-analyses over time is that the effect size is basically 0. Okay, and sometimes it's positive and sometimes it's negative. So we really have to understand the situational components. So I'm going to focus on the things that you have control over. Okay, and I'm going to focus on 2. One is how you manage conflict, and then I'm going to talk about how you express conflict. Okay, so first is managing conflict, right? And I just want to kind of give you a nice little framework for thinking about all the different ways people manage conflict or they come at it, right? And they basically vary in terms of how much concern people have for the other person, right? And how much concern they have for themselves and their own outcomes. So you can imagine, you know, when I care a lot about my own outcome and I don't care about yours, I'm going to use forcing strategies. Like I'm just going to force my opinion on you. If I care a lot about your outcome and not a lot about mine, I'm going to give in. I'm just going to let you have your way. If I don't care about either, I'll avoid the conflict. It's not worth trying to resolve. And if there's kind of moderate, I'll compromise or give in. And of course, in situations where you have, I care about your outcome and I care about my outcome, that's when you see more problem-solving strategies. Okay, now problem-solving strategies are the gold standard. And we're often in situations where we care about both. We care about our own outcomes, and in collaborations, we tend to care about the other party, and we also tend to care about the group outcome. It's not just the other person, but just make sure collectively we have a good outcome, a good agreement, a good decision. Okay, so as we think about these different problem solving or conflict management strategies, there are situations where, yes, we want to use problem solving when we're trying to work out a solution that serves everyone's needs, when we're trying to come up with a creative solution that incorporates multiple perspectives, but sometimes the other strategies can be useful to you as well. For example, when you're compromising, you're finding a middle of the road solution, right? And so these are often done, these are situations where you're trying to find that compromise. I'm going to get to situations in a second. Hold on one sec. Okay, when you're avoiding discussing differences of opinion as much as possible, and you're avoiding confrontations with other people. When you're giving in or yielding or avoiding, you're letting others have their way. And when you're forcing the other side, you're pushing your own point of view. So think about your teams and your collaborations and how much you tend to rely on these different strategies, because teams do have their go-to strategies, and the most effective ones are the ones that can shift around depending on what's at stake. Okay, so sure, problem solving is great, but sometimes we don't have the time, right? So we want to think about what are the factors we want to consider when choosing the conflict management strategy, the best one for you in the situation. So one, first of all, think about the issues that are at stake. How important are the outcomes, the principles, or the values, right? The more important, the more you may want to move toward problem solving. Think about the relationships between people, right? And so this gets to, and also relative power. So this comes to the question, I think that Matthew mentioned earlier, but the relationship in terms of, is your goal also to maintain a close, mutually supportive relationship, or do you not care about the other side? Or who has more power, and do you need to be deferential, or do you need to come at someone in a more roundabout way in order to get what you want, because you can't be as direct? How much time do you have, right? Some approaches take a lot more time than others. And sometimes it's not worth engaging if you don't have a lot of time and it's not that important. And then, of course, what's the culture of the team and of the organization, of your department, in terms of what's an acceptable way to approach the conflict at hand? So if you think about all these things, it'll help you come to choose good conflict management strategies for you. So these are some examples, right? Problem solving, when the issues are important, when time's not a problem, when you've got support, like all the information you need, maybe, and when you think there's an opportunity for a win-win solution or satisfying both sides' needs, right? Avoiding when you have a small issue or you have limited time and resources, you may use forcing in an emergency, like we have to do this and we have to do it quickly. And I know what I'm doing is right. You may force in those situations. There's only one right way, or you're trying to protect people from being taken advantage of. You might use yielding and accommodating when you're interested in keeping harmony in the group. That relationship really matters. Or you're trying to build credits with someone else, right? So you're building in some reciprocity. I'll help you now, you help me later. And finally, there's compromising. This usually is a strategy. So compromising is meeting in the middle, right? And this is not an ideal strategy because everybody has to give up something. And it assumes it's kind of a win-lose situation. So we use this when we're stuck and it seems like the only way we're going to reach a solution is to compromise, or maybe a partial win is better than an impasse or walking away from the table. All right. So I'm going to pause here for a minute and see what type of reactions or questions you have about conflict management strategies, what's worked for you, what concerns you have, and so on.
There's one question in the chat. Are there times where focusing primarily on tasks leads the group or the leader to avoid addressing process or relationship conflict?
Yeah, a great question. One of my former mentors, Paul Goodman, used to always tell me that when you're in a group that has a creative abrasion or relationship conflict, working on a common task where you can get things done and feel good about your progress is a great way to improve the relationship among people. And to some extent, I believe that's true. And I say to some extent, right? So if the relationship conflict is one that where you can still work together and get things done, that the relationship conflict isn't interfering with your task performance, that's a good strategy. But when the relationship conflict has gotten to the point that it does interfere with your ability to collaborate and to work with one another, that's the time when you need to address it. And generally the advice, and we're going to talk about these difficult conversations next week, but the general advice when dealing with relationship conflict is a one-on-one conversation using skill sets, listening skill sets, and perspective taking. We're going to talk more about that next week in difficult conversations, again, when the conflict is emotional. Usually relationship conflicts are between two people in a group. They're not in the whole group. Mm-hmm. And so addressing them in front of everyone else tends to escalate it. It makes it work and people start worse, and it makes people take sides. So that's why you want to do it kind of one-on-one, or you may use a mediator.
Right. And Kevin has a question. He's got his hand up.
Thanks, Sharon. Laurie, I was wondering about adjusting one's conflict management strategy. For example, if you naturally default to, say, problem solving, but you are engaged with an individual who is more forcing, or in the opposite, where it could be where someone who is just avoiding the conflict. Do you find yourself potentially adjusting your style or your natural tendency with a strategy?
Yes, that's a great question, Kevin. I appreciate it. And the two sides of the coin are slightly different to each other. So when someone's being very aggressive with you, they're using a forcing strategy. The goal is to move them over to a more problem-solving approach, right? And so think about it. When people use forcing, they don't care about your outcome. They only care about their own, typically. So somehow you need to engage them in a way to care about your outcome. And there's two ways to do that. One is to try and get them to really care, genuine concern. And the other is instrumental concern, or you get them to care about your outcome. Because if they don't care about your outcome, they're not going to get what they want. So it's that interdependence, right? So that's the instrumental piece of it, that's saying, look, you don't have to really care about me, but if you don't take my perspective into account, this is not going to get resolved. So we need to work together. So that's a way to move to a more problem-solving approach. So that is, it's demonstrating, look, I could force right back, but we're not going to get anywhere. So let's move over to this other approach. And usually naming the approach is better. So, to explicitly say, look, we could do this, but here's where it's going to take us. So let's try this approach instead. On the flip side, the avoidance piece, if someone's avoiding a conflict and you want to get them to the table, sometimes you can force them to the table, put them in a situation where they can't avoid it any longer, but then you want to very quickly switch over to a more problem-solving approach, right? So again, you need to read the other side. And I think that dual concern model I showed you back here is a nice one to kind of assess and guess how is the other side going to come at me potentially, or how should I be thinking about the situation? Okay, any other questions before I move on? Okay, what I want to do now is switch over to the issue of conflict expression. So how we actually communicate our disagreements to one another. Okay, so I want to start with a scenario. Imagine that there's a situation where there's two team members, we'll call them Thomas and Mary, and they're engaged in a conflict over how to design a study. So whatever discipline you're in, just think about whatever it is, with your collaborators, you might have different disagreements on. Your collaborator could be your advisor. We're actually going to talk about that next week. Your collaborator could be another student, it could be a teammate, it could be someone you work with, and so on. Okay. All right, so imagine a situation. Here's version 1. So these two co-workers, team members, are engaged in a conflict. Here's what happened. Tom tries to explain why he believes the design is appropriate and rolls out multiple alternative explanations. Mary listens but remains concerned. She suggests that Thomas may not have considered some potential unintended consequences of the design and that they may want to discuss the issue further. Thomas disagrees. Okay, there's one. Here's version 2. Tom defends his reasoning and unequivocally states that the design is the right approach and the others are wrong. Mary interrupts him before he's finished. She asserts that Thomas does not have the expertise to make design decisions about the study and demands they reopen the issue. Thomas disagrees. These two conflicts are over the same thing. The content is the same. There's task conflict, there's some process conflict, there's some relationship conflict here. But they haven't gotten to conflict management stage. They're just expressing their disagreements. And they're expressing them very differently, right? So in the first example, there's conflicting views about the study design, but there's listening, right? And there's openness. On the other side, there's not, right? There's intense reactions, closed-mindedness, and so on. Okay. Can you imagine, have you been in conflicts that feel like one or the other or both? I know I have, yeah. At least with the cameras on, I see heads nodding. appreciate it. I know I've been in both types of interactions. And if we think about proactively about our tendencies individually and as a group to express our disagreements, we can also leverage conflict more positively. Okay, so let me just give you a framework to think about this now, right? Don't we love these like 2x2s, right? I can't, you know, two-dimensional graphs, aren't they great? Okay, so this is work I've done on conflict expression. So imagine two different dimensions on which our expressions can differ. The first is the oppositional intensity. So think about intensity, like how intensely do I communicate my disagreement? So it can be very low to high. And when you think about intensity, you can think about it in terms of how attacking or defending my statements are, right? So I might not be in the low end, I'm not defensive, I'm more open-minded, I'm trying to incorporate the other person's perspective. And the high intensity conflicts, I'm more attacking, I'm defending my positions, I'm potentially undermining yours, right? So I'm trying to win here, right? So those are the intensity dimension, okay? The directness the directness dimension can also vary from low to high, and we can think about two aspects of directness. One is the ambiguity in the communication, right? I can really say what the problem is and disagree. I can be very direct and unambiguous, or I can be very unclear, right? You know, where you are not exactly sure what the problem is, or I can say it's about, like, maybe this is about the task and I don't like the way you did the task, but really I'm pissed at you because you were once again late to a meeting and I'm just going to take it out, you know, and right. So it could be either one. Another way directness varies is by who you're talking to. So sometimes we communicate our disagreement directly to the other person we're having a problem with. And sometimes we go and talk about them to other people, right? Because of course this is happening in a social context. So we can be direct by directly communicating with the other party, or we can be indirect and talk about them to another person on the team, our significant other. It just could be venting, it could be talking behind their back, but those are all indirect ways I'm communicating my opposition. Okay. All right, so great. So we have these are very kind of more latent theoretical, but when you put them together, you get 4 different very common prototypes of how we communicate our disagreement. The first is debate, right? Think about it. We're very direct and low intensity. We're doing this exchange of ideas, back and forth discussion, point, counterpoint. You ramp up the intensity, our debates turn into arguments, right? We're very direct, but we're also attacking and attacking and defending. Okay. Now imagine the intensity stays high, but now our directness decreases. These are undermining behaviors. So now the conflict's intense. I'm really attacking you, but I'm doing it in a indirect way. And there's lots of ways we do this, right? We might complain about someone behind their back. We might be dismissive of them, or we might even use mean teasing, right? Like a way to denigrate the other person, make them the target of a joke that is isolating. Okay. All right. And then finally, the 4th quadrant here are these indirect and low intensity expressions where I call them disguised, right? Where the emotions are somewhat concealed. The vague responses might be vague, positions are hidden. You know something's going on, but you're just not sure what it is. And at the same time, you say, well, is something going on, or is it just me? Am I being overly sensitive that once again they didn't return my email, or or they made a kind of a biting remark in response to my excuse me. Right, so those are the disguised behaviors. So now I want you to think about your collaborations. There's two ways to think about this, right? What approaches do you tend to use? What's comfortable for you? And for the collaborations that you're in, what are the most typical things that occur? And then how do you feel about it when it happens? Okay, because what's really important to know here is that you and I could be in the same conflict and have an interaction. I could record it, and you would categorize it one way, and I could categorize it a different way, right? And that's so tied up with our individual backgrounds, our experiences, our cultures, all these things that make us who we are. So in the research we're doing on conflict expression now, we're focusing on the experience of conflict expression, because these individual differences in teams, we find lots of evidence that people differ within groups. And if we can capture these differences within groups, we can better help teams function. Okay. Someone made a comment, I just opened it up. Gendered, right? So there's gender comes into play here as well, right? So it's not just how you perceive it, but how you're perceived, right? So in the comment here about directness has a gendered effect, where a woman is seen as direct, is seen as more aggressive, yes, right? So we have our mental models as receivers of actions where we encode what happens from the other side. And it could be effect on our models of what a woman should look like, act like, what an engineer should do, what a Black person behavior should look like, what a younger person should do, what a close colleague should do, what an advisor should do. We all have our mental categories, and we interpret the results, and then our own personalities and our own relative status will influence how we respond. Okay. Yes. Okay, so given that, here are, so we have an assessment of experience of conflict expression that focuses on this prototypical behavior, where we can ask people, we just really, I mean, this has a lot of face validity, right? The items make sense: quarrel, argue, fight, engage, go back and forth, deliberate, engage in debates, dismissive behavior, teasing behavior, complaining, disguising behavior. We use it to measure, but you can also use this to think about your groups, okay? And what works and what doesn't work. Of course, once again, not surprisingly, debate is the gold standard. But and so let me just show you some of the findings, and then we're gonna have a lot of time for Q&A. So I do this all the time. I blow through these. In fact, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna throw you in breakout groups. Are you guys up for that? For a little bit of discussion? Okay, good. So I'm going to just define this. I'm gonna throw you in some breakout groups to just share some of your experiences around conflict expression. And then we're gonna come back, because I'd love to get you a little bit more engaged. Okay, so, but let me just show you what we know about these things. So interestingly, what we're finding is that certainly, this is not going to be surprising, conflict is harmful when it's expressed less directly or more intensely. Argue, undermine, and disguise. And we see that time and time again. Okay. The conflict, the debate side of thing is sometimes we see variance on it and sometimes not. It depends on the task. Like if the task is very heavily reliant on debate, then this form of conflict expression becomes really important. But in other types of groups where we're doing different types of tasks that don't, where the other types of conflict expressions become more important. Like when you put them all together at the same time. And it's these harmful behaviors that argue, undermine, and disguise, that interfere. So that's one important finding. This is like hot off the presses because we have a paper that we're about to submit. And the second piece is that, you might assume that having a group that everyone's kind of the same in their experience of conflict would be a good thing. But that's actually not the case. And when I explain this to you, this is going to make sense, I think. It's actually when you have diversity of experiences in a team, the team is more likely to be able to break out of these undermine, argue, or disguising type of behavior. So somebody in the group, either, or some subset, either is experiencing the same thing, but it's okay. Like they just don't see it as much of a problem, so they don't get sucked into it. Or it may be that there's subgroups in the group who are having different experiences. And so the people who are having a less worse experience are able to help the people who are having a worse experience. Does that make sense? So diversity actually can be a good thing in that regard. Diversity of experience in terms of their conflict expression. Diversity is often a good thing, but you wouldn't think that, well, diversity, I think just playing this out in the thought experiment is something people tend not to do. All right, with that, I'm going to, let's see. So, I think I need to do it now that I'm the host. So let me just set up breakout rooms where I'm gonna do it. Oh my God, you'd think like I haven't done this for like a whole minute and it's like out of my mind how to do it. Where is it? It should be under more. Oh, there we go, breakout rooms, I found it. All right, so I'm gonna set up like 1, 2, 5 breakout rooms. 1, 2, yeah, I'll set up 5 and throw you into it just for some quick discussion about your experience with conflict expression and what factors do you think have influenced your conflict expression and your comfort level. So why don't we think about it kind of at that personal level, okay?
One of the things this is Vicky, one of the things our group talked about was emotions. I wonder if you could talk a little bit. I said, some of this sounds so logical. Like, yes, of course, this is what you should do, but how do like your own emotions and the other person's emotions, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, great question. Good commercial for next week. That's right. So emotions can happen in response to any type of conflict, task, relationship, process, whatever. And they're difficult to manage, right? A lot of times, what I'm going to talk about is, what I'll talk about briefly now, is trying to understand what people's triggers are, like what's causing them to have, or yourself, to have that emotional reaction. So if we can understand, usually people get very emotional when they either feel threatened or something that their value is threatened. So it could be their self-esteem, affiliation, or so on. And so trying to understand what's kind of triggering for the individual and addressing those. And so for myself, for the individual, I think it's recognizing why you're feeling the way you're feeling, if it's so strong, deciding if it's a productive response, it's something you want to address or hide, because sometimes I know my emotional responses don't belong in the group. It depends on the group, and it's something I just need to deal with separately. And sometimes it's something that I do. So generally speaking, though, if it's something that you can't put to the side, it needs to be addressed either personally or interpersonally. And I think all the research on relationships apply here as well. When you're working with a collaborator, you're in a relationship, and managing the emotions that come into play when there's conflict is just as important if you want to continue the collaboration. But did you have a more direct question or other types of follow-up to that, or other issues or other perspectives that you all have on that issue? There's a lot of, experience and expertise in the room.
We talked a lot about different ways that you can express what you're trying to say in a way that sort of invites the other person to help you, to be more of a helper, than making it a conflict. Like either sort of indirect questions, like instead of questioning something, just like, well, I'm wondering about this, and then maybe they will answer, or I'm trying to understand this, or how this might apply here, that it's not quite the same as saying, I think you're wrong. It's inviting them to think or explain more, but in the direction that your comments are going.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So what I didn't get to talk about today, and I think what you're getting at right now, is what does it sound like to have a collaborative conversation? What does it sound like to invite participation? What does it sound like to be open-minded and have a shared problem? And I went to that upper right, the concern of self, concern of other. What does that sound like, right? And being indirect, being direct but not intense. What does that sound like, right? So it is very much about focusing on a shared problem, that this is not your problem or my problem, it's ours to resolve. Recognize the interdependence, that will be both, we can be better off together. Inviting alternative perspectives, listening to them, use active listening, feed that back what you've heard, integrate those perspectives into your own, consider the implications. And that's really hard to do when you're feeling defensive. That's really hard to do. It takes practice, and it takes, to recognizing your emotions, moving them to the side so that you can focus on the problem. Then if the emotions are the problem, or the relationship is the problem, how do you deal with that? Yeah, no, those are all really important points. Do you all have tricks that you do to kind of refocus yourself when you're feeling very defensive, or see a conflict escalating?
Phoebe has, there are a couple comments in the chat, one from Phoebe and I think one from Krista. Maybe they want to vocalize.
Yeah, I'd love to have you just hear them. It's hard for me to monitor the chat while we're doing this. Phoebe, do you want to?
Yeah, I can go. I think in my group we talked a little about just the various sources of differences in terms of conflict expression and conflict management, and how difficult it can be to even unpack some of those sources for ourselves, let alone communicate that to the other person when it's like a high intensity situation, for example. And we did talk a little about, for example, setting ground rules for a space or a working relationship even before problems crop up, so that we kind of have something to refer to when things get hard. And even then, it may not guarantee kind of quote unquote compliance with those common grounds.
Yeah, no, that's a great best practice early in team formation, or even when you're doing a check-in, to think about your ground rules. You I've seen them called team contracts, but it's the same general principle, is that what are our rules of engagement? How are we going to treat each other? What are our aspirations for our process? And the benefit of doing that early and having it, even writing it down, is that you can refer back to it. And so when somebody violates the contract, you're not going to say, oh, look, you broke the contract, but you can go back and say, hey, we agreed to this. It seems like we're getting to a bad place. Let's revisit what we committed to early on and see what changes we can make, or understand why we're not there and what's going on. So a lot of times people use a team contract to focus on like we're going to use email, or we're going to, here's how we're going to communicate. But I'd also challenge you to use it to set ground rules about showing respect, and how we're going to resolve conflict, and how we're going to treat one another. Yeah. Kevin? Oh, you're muted. Yeah.
20 months of this, I still do it. To your question about as things are escalating, I love the idea of the contract. One of the things I'll try to do is at the beginning of the conversations to, hopefully find areas of commonality or agreement, areas of agreement. And if we can bring those up throughout the conversation, because hopefully then the two sides, if there are just two sides to this conflict, we see that we're hopefully more alike than we are apart, or that we're both trying to reach the same goal, maybe just through different paths. But again, trying to get some sense of a shared purpose, a shared commonality, which Alejandra and Caden heard all about with my in our breakout room. So that's just something I've used.
Yeah, that's great. The subordinate goal, shared purpose, or even just one issue you're aligned on is a nice way to demonstrate that you're there's mutual gain here, right? And we really do have similar goals, even though we might be coming at them differently. Yeah. So I'm also seeing comment. I'm so bad at monitoring the chat while I'm talking. So please feel free to jump in.
A lot of them are being said out loud, but also people are following up. So it's not anything that you need to.
Okay, great, thanks. Other things that were talked about that we haven't touched on, right? So I see the issue, there's issues of avoidance. Oh, I did see I think Sharon, you might have posted this earlier, maybe, or someone, but oftentimes you have a group of people where no one wants to rock the boat, right? So everyone's really trying to be a good team player, and a good team player to them means not disagreeing. And that's just as bad as conflict escalation, because you're not bringing to bear the expertise that everyone brings to the table. Right. So either everyone's the same and has the same perspective, and therefore why have a group in the first place? Or, which is unlikely, I mean, everyone has a unique perspective or something to add. And so the question is, if people are self-censoring, why is that the case? Do they either feel that the situation's unsafe to share a disagreement, that maybe they're going to get shot down, or are they afraid that the norms are so strong that you don't rock the boat, that you don't bring it up? So team leads can play a really good role in setting the norms that it's okay to disagree, and modeling the way we disagree, right? How you communicate a disagreement. So you could have an explicit conversation about it, or you can model it yourself. And by the way, it doesn't have to be the team lead. It can be anyone, right? And if you feel uncomfortable raising a question in the group, is there another way you can surface the concern so that it gets discussed? You've heard the devil's advocacy role. That's usually a nice role. When you have a group where everyone just seems to be agreeing, assign someone the role of devil's advocate. Your job is to disagree and raise all the points at which someone could disagree. So now I'm not attributing it to you as a disagreeable person, but you're bringing up onto the table ways that alternative points of view. Very useful.
Sometimes making sure that people know what the issues to be discussed are in advance also helps, because I find that there are some people who are very quick on their feet, and so they're the ones whose ideas are going to come up. So might not be that someone's purposely withholding ideas, but they just need longer to think before expressing their ideas, and they always want to make sure that they've considered things. And so I try to let people know the issues ahead. And sometimes I actually find ways for them to anonymously respond. And then I can present, here's what came from the group, but I'm not necessarily saying so-and-so said this or so-and-so said this. Like I'm trying to get the ideas on the table without particular attribution sometimes.
Yeah, and that's a really nice way to do it. So you think about that as being a common approach in general brainstorming or brain writing, because we know brain writing is a more efficient way than brainstorming. But brain writing is anonymous input typically, and you're sourcing up a whole bunch of ideas or perspectives, or the anonymous complaint box or whatever, however you want to come at it. But if people feel more comfortable bringing that up without their name attributed to it, that's a nice way to manage it. Yeah. Positively reinforcing the disagreement, so when someone brings an alternative perspective it can completely disappear if nobody mirrors it or responds to it. So whenever someone brings up an alternative perspective, the rest of the team or the team lead should take the time to say, oh, that's an interesting perspective. Help me understand it. Ask a follow-up question. Do something to incorporate it into the conversation, right? Because oftentimes a minority perspective, some perspective that's very different than everyone else's, gets dismissed because no one else has thought of it. We see this in group decision-making research all the time and processes. And so new opinions and perspectives that get responded to and reacted to are the ones that get integrated, at least considered. They may be dismissed, they may not make it into the decision, but at least they're discussed. Yeah. Any other topics before we sign off today? Burning questions. We are next week going to talk more about emotions, more about status. So we think about conflicts between students and advisors. We're actually going to do a role play. Wait, I'm going to actually open up that slide. So part 2, we're going to talk about having difficult conversations. What if the conflict is more personal or sensitive, is likely to be emotional, is with someone of higher status, involves giving negative feedback. So how do I navigate potentially difficult conversations? So next week, we are going to do a role play scenario during the session. Before I was going to do it between sessions, but I think it's going to be better during. So anyone who shows up to next week's session, they're going to be assigned a confidential role of either a doctoral student or their advisor who have jointly been working on a manuscript. And then there's some problems that have arisen regarding expectations for the deliverable. So one will play the role of Sam and the other will play the role of Dr. Franklin. And you're going to have an opportunity to actually practice engaging in this difficult conversation between advisor and student. Okay. And then we'll debrief it. So I'll talk a little bit about difficult conversations and how to think about it and what's really going on in these difficult conversations often. Then you'll practice it and then we'll discuss it. So it'll be a slightly different format than today. Okay.
Great, Laurie, thank you so much for engaging us in this discussion today. It seems like it was really useful to a lot of people, and the breakout rooms, I think, worked really well. So we'll look forward to, actually lots of thanks are coming into the chat. We'll look forward to spending some time with you again next Monday.
Great, my pleasure. And thanks everyone who joined us. I just want to put a shout out to Janine who's here. Janine helped us identify the scenario we're going to do the role play next week. So along with Allie. So thanks so much and we'll see you next week.
All right. Thanks,
Okay.
Laurie.
All right. Bye-bye.